Great. Thanks, Karen. I'm Greg Conti. Honored to be with you here today. And I agree that panels, they can either be boring or they can be interesting. And the more controversial they are, the more interesting they are. So I'd encourage you to, while we're going through the initial kind of discussion and framing remarks, think about the questions you'd like to ask and save those. We're going to try and leave ample time for questions at the end and go ahead and ask them. And I'll just start off with one example. I was at moderating a panel led by, they were all active government officials at the time, and I asked them what I thought was an easy question of, if you were king or queen for a day, what policy change would you make in regard to this cybersecurity issue? And one of the panelists looked like they choked on their lemonade, because apparently you don't want to get ahead of the White House in suggesting policy changes. So, but anyway, think up your good questions. I'm looking forward to a great panel today, and honored to be joined by very, very distinguished folks. So the way we're going to do it is I'll introduce each person and give them an opportunity to provide some initial framing comments. And then we'll move on to the next. We've gone through all three. We'll have some initial kind of starter questions, and then we'll move over to your questions, because I know that's what you're most interested in. Okay, with that, I'd like to introduce Mr. Kip Brailey. He's the Associate Director for Intelligence at the U.S. Department of Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. He has over 26 years at CIA and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And sir, I'd ask you to go ahead and provide some introductory remarks.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. I think the two most bemused people in the world are my two sons, for me speaking at a cyber conference. They've watched me try and load software and things like that, and they probably think this is about the biggest hoot in the world. I think the other bemused person is one of my employees who's here, who's a presidential management fellow, and probably says, boy, they're really, scraping the river to get him up. But anyway, I'm the Associate Director for Intelligence at FinCEN. It's always great to be the Associate Director for Intelligence. You assume you're not the Associate Director for Stupidity. It's kind of, always found that kind of funny. FinCEN is the U.S. government's financial intelligence unit. Most governments have them. We are probably we are the biggest. We collect 1.3 million suspicious activity reports per year from various different institutions, banks, and so forth. It's an enormous set of information, and within that information, I think there's a checkbox for cyber, or if there isn't, there will be. And we also mine the information to try and find things that have to do with cyber. My background is that I have been following the money for a long time. After 9/11, we found how really useful following the money for terrorists is. And the thing that I always tell my new employees is that if you're in Afghanistan, you're on their turf. But if you're in the U.S. financial system, you're on our turf. And I think that really helps. The thing that FinCEN is trying to do in the cyber world is to try and level the playing field. When we have cyber criminals or people using various different virtual currency aspects, a lot of times the reason why it's profitable is because they're not subject, or they don't think they're subject to all the rules and regulations, the onerous rules and regulations that the U.S. government has. So you'll have a Bank of America saying, well, of course they can do it cheaper because they're not following, AML rules. So part of our, it's our playing field to find the bad guys, but we also want to have an even playing field out there for people. Being a little bit of a student of history, I would say that if you look at one point, I was stupid enough to think I was going to write a dissertation. For those of you who did, I'm very, very proud of you. I did not. And it was going to be on financial warfare and looking at the Second World War. But I would argue that if you look at the history of financial and economic warfare, typically governments have not chosen to do things like debase each other's currency, attack each other's banking system. And I think, although we do see some of that in the cyber world, I think there's, among large governments, the example I think that Dick Clark mentioned was that the Iranians did it for 10 days and then stopped. I think that at the end of the day, that will be an example that will hold on kind of this, blowing up the entire internet, destroying the system. I hope that I'm right on that. I would also note that Michael Morrell talked about sharing economic intelligence, and this is a conundrum that we face at FinCEN. We actually have a safe harbor provision where we can share with banks and the private sector within a certain committee, but I can tell you that just if we find the name of an IP address of a cyber criminal, getting that name out to the banks, I mean, what was Dick Clark saying? Something about you have 3 hours? I mean, 3 hours is really quick. I mean, 3 months, 3 months to get through the lawyers would be a record time, I think. So, I think that gets to kind of my main theme later, which is that government is not flexible in this space. We talk, a lot of the pre-questions had to do with government attacks in the cyber world, but my view is that the government attacks aren't my biggest concern. My biggest concern are all those smaller actors that Michael mentioned. In the news is the flash crash of 2010, an individual actor out there exacerbating, making something really awful. I'm kind of a movie buff, and one of my favorite actors was Peter Sellers, for those of you who remember Peter Sellers. And there was a great movie, very campy, called The Mouse That Roared. And basically Peter Sellers is out there, he's running a country, they're getting bankrupt, they decide they're going to invade America, like 4 of them, so that they can get defeated and then receive financial aid from the United States and be rebuilt. That was kind of campy, but in a way, The Mouse That Roared is not all that unviable now. We've seen very small countries building cyber capabilities that are way out of proportion of their size and going after us. So, that might be the new, Peter Sellers is long dead, but that might be the new mouse that roared. I don't know that we do worry about China and countries like that, but some of the smaller countries can have an effect, and more importantly, just the non-state actors out there when they get serious about it. And this adds to an incredible complexity for our workspace. We have people looking at things like, well, how many cryptocurrency entities are there out there? And our last count was about 1,700, somewhere over 1,700. That's just a phenomenal number, and some of them don't do much, but just the fact that I know that number is an incredible analytic lift. And to monitor those would be very difficult. We asked filers to file where they can on Bitcoin, and I think we had over 3,000 SARs on Bitcoin last year. So, just to go through those 3,000 SARs is a heavy lift. The financial lesson on looking at the whole financial marketplace is that what we often find in those suspicious activity reports is that bad guys are dealing with, or the banks are dealing with bad guys and don't know it. And, we end up finding out that multiple banks have dealt with multiple bad guys who have knowable bad IP addresses and they don't know it. So, that's the sharing that is something that becomes kind of our issue. And the key issue is that government is not agile in that. We can't do it quickly. Cyber should be our home field. We're good at it, as a nation. But sharing is difficult. Getting expertise is difficult. My lead analyst, my first hire in joining FinCEN was an internal hire. It was a gentleman that was on rotation to us looking at Bitcoin and virtual currency. Although he'd gone to college, he had no degree. Did not look like an analyst to me. I was used to hiring people from, really, really great schools with, clean cut. His first briefing for Undersecretary Cohen, he had to go out and buy a suit because he didn't own one. He had long hair, wore leather, played in the band, and is incredibly brilliant at virtual currency, Bitcoin, and actually we send him out to train other government agencies. I was lucky to find this guy, and I don't know where I'd find other people like him. And I also know that just the way we hire would make me very difficult to find people like that. So getting that expertise, which is out there, is very difficult for us. Which leads me to my final pitch before I turn it over is FinCEN, if you have friends or sons and daughters who are looking for internships, we have some wonderful internships. My Bitcoin guy currently has 3 or 4 people sitting with him and working on it. You'll learn a lot. And we also just put out, this week, we formed a cyber unit, and we have the chief out, so that's out on USA Jobs. But I'll turn it over now.
Great. Thank you very much. And just very quickly on Bitcoin, I was at RSA and I visited a hacker friend. He was at his claim to fame is he was at the DEF CON 1 hacker conference, and he was like 16, and his mom, his parents actually let him go to Las Vegas unattended. But he related a story, and we'll consider this hearsay, of a friend who built a Bitcoin mining machine, put it in a closet and forgot about it. And this was very early on. It was just a little hobby project. And then a couple of years later, and again, this is hearsay, $700,000 worth of Bitcoins were sitting on it. So of all those cryptocurrencies, you have to choose the right one, I guess. Okay, so our next panelist is Dr. Jane Lute. Again, very distinguished record, formerly Deputy Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security from 2009 to 2013. And currently she's the CEO at the Center for Internet Security and the Special Advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations. In addition, she was national security staff under both President Bush and President Clinton. Ma'am, your introductory remarks.
Thanks very much. So the title of the panel really focuses on threats, and I'm going to talk about threats, but I'm going to do it in a way that really focuses on the role that we expect government to play in cybersecurity. But I'm going to do that by laying out to you how I look at cybersecurity, because I think there's a lot of what I call B3 out there, blah, blah, blah. You know, there's B5 and B7, blah, 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 blah. And nobody can make any hides or tails of cybersecurity. I think there are only 3 interesting questions when it comes to cybersecurity. The rest, as we say in my religious tradition, is commentary. Question number 1. How do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? How do we architect systems we can trust from components we cannot? Question number 2. How do we ensure the integrity of our information and our identities in an open internet? And all of the elements of that sentence are important. How do we ensure the integrity of our information and our identity in an open internet? So question number 1, how do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? Question number 2, how do we ensure the integrity of our information and our identities in an open internet? And question number 3, what will the role of government be in all of this? Now, this wouldn't even be an interesting question if we were in physical space, because governments are used to being the dominant players. They're used to being the monopolists when it comes to security in physical space. But in cyberspace, governments have not been given that assignment. Security is typically something that societies assign to governments to handle. We want safe streets, governments, you run the police. We want a safe country, governments, you make the laws, you run the military. So governments are used to being the monopolists in security space, and they are not in cyberspace. Why not? I think it's principally because governments don't have the power that matters when it comes to cyberspace. So why are governments the monopolists in security space? Because they have legitimate control over lethality. They have the power to protect us. But that's not the power that matters in cyberspace. It's the power to connect us, not the power to protect us, which constitutes power in cyberspace. And so when you're talking about powerful actors in cyberspace, you run out of fingers before you get to the first government. And no 2 governments out of the 193 members of the United Nations are approaching this problem in the same way. Most governments, including our own, are predominantly, at least at the federal level, approaching this problem from a national security point of view. So I spent the last 5 years deeply immersed in the homeland security world. And I can tell you that homeland security and national security are 2 different cats. National security is strategic, centralized, and top-driven. Can you think of any 3 words in the English vocabulary less descriptive of the internet than strategic, centralized, and top-driven? I can't. Yet that is the way we are predominantly approaching the problem of cybersecurity, as if it were principally a national security problem. And as Kip laid out for you, we've got basically a public safety problem the vast majority of us have. How big is the problem? In 1995, how many people were online? About 16 million. and 85% of them were English-speaking North Americans. Today, how many people are online? 3 billion. Growing at a rate of about 100 connections a minute. There are trillions of devices online. And that second half of the world's population is not going to take 20 years to come online. Half the population of China is online and connected. So I mentioned that there's a difference between national security and homeland security. National security is strategic, centralized, and top-driven. Information is shared on the basis of need to know. Homeland security is transactional, it's decentralized, and it's bottom-driven, driven by the states and the municipalities in this country. It's an altogether different approach to security. And information makes its way around on the basis of duty to share. Now, if we're going to address the threats that exist in cyberspace, by the way, if I were queen for a day, I would wave my wand and say the one thing that will change the game with respect to reducing our vulnerability to cyber attacks is basic hygiene. I mean, I can give you 4 questions that you can ask at your enterprise. You will be shocked at the answer, so have nerves of steel. And if you could demonstrate to yourself and to your satisfaction, and there are standards for doing so, satisfactory answers to those questions, you could eliminate 80 to 90% of all known attacks that you are suffering right now. And I mean, I'm not the American Dental Association, but I stand by that assertion. So how should the government approach this problem? I mean, we're in the middle of a global cyber awakening. It's really hard to overstate the impact that access to the internet, the power of data liquidity, and the connectivity between individuals and ideas is having. And it's forcing governments to do business differently in all respects. Economic respects, social respects, political respects. There is this massive desire for more. And this global cyber awakening is careening and colliding with a near total collapse in trust in public institutions. We don't trust the media, we don't trust markets, we don't trust business, we don't trust all kinds of things, in some cases even our governments. So where will we give the assignment for cybersecurity, irrespective of where the threat comes from? How do we craft a role for government in this space? We will not ensure our cybersecurity by trying to run this as an intelligence program. If we've learned nothing over the past 5 years, it is fundamentally that secrecy does not scale. And so as we think about the threats that we face in cyberspace, and they're every minute of every day on every device you own, those 3 questions I come back to. How do we architect systems we can trust from components we can't? How do we ensure the integrity of our identity and our information while maintaining an open internet? And what will the role of government be? Thanks.
No easy solutions there, though. Our third panelist, Mr. Shane Harris, who's a distinguished author and journalist. He's written extensively on intelligence and national security, and he's author of the fine book, At War, a book, in my personal opinion, I know you're all lawyers, so I will say in my personal opinion, not my government opinion, should all be on your bookshelves. It's very well done. He's currently a senior correspondent at the Daily Beast, where he covers national security, intelligence, and cybersecurity. Sir.
Great, thanks very much, and thanks to the Center for putting together the panel and for having me. I thought I would use my remarks to try and take a stab at answering the question that's put before us in the title of the panel, which is, when does a cyber threat rise to the level of a national security concern? And I've never served in government, and I don't have a security clearance. I'm just a journalist, so take this for what you will. But I've been observing this space for a long time, and I think it's a very interesting question to be asking right now. And I think that if you were asking this before December 16th, 2014, the answer would look very different. Or sorry, December 19th, which is the day that President Obama came out in his last press conference of the year and announced that North Korea was responsible for the attack on Sony and that the United States would be engaging in a proportional response to that cyber attack. Prior to that, and I write about this in my book, I think they were pretty. I wouldn't say the lines were clear on what rises to a level of national security or an act of war in cyberspace, but the Defense Department had done a pretty good job of spelling out the kinds of cyber attacks on the United States that would merit a response in kind and possibly even in the kinetic space offline from the United States. And those were really big catastrophic cyber attacks. Cyber attack on an industrial control system that regulates or controls a power grid or a piece of infrastructure, something on a vital national communication system that caused it to go down for a long time, an attack on a financial system that caused a disruption to data or to the economy, things that cause big consequences, big events, economic damage, possibly cause people to die. These would be in the realm of things that it seems to me, in my read anyway, the Defense Department would say to the President, this is hostile, this is an act of war, it's an act of aggression, and you have the responsibility, the right and possibly the responsibility to respond in kind to that. So then Sony gets hacked. And the President comes out and says that we will engage in a proportional response to that event, proportional drawing from the language of the law of armed conflict, which sort of starts to position this whole response in this event into something that sort of looks like an act of war, an act of aggression. What exactly is it? We're not sure, but we're going to take some kind of response to it. And he says that we'll do it at a time of our choosing. That was a really sort of pivotal moment, I think, and it started to kind of muddy the lines, maybe even more than they already were, but you're adding this whole new set of activity in that clearly does not rise to the level of those other hostile actions. People did not die. This was not an attack on an entire sector of the economy. There were no pieces of critical infrastructure that were affected. It was very bad for Sony. It was certainly destructive on their end in terms of the data that was lost, the computers that were shut down. It was very embarrassing for many of the executives that were involved. It was embarrassing for some of the celebrities that were involved. And it was certainly, it seems to me, an act of political aggression insofar as North Korea appeared to be threatening Americans and moviegoers and movie theaters for showing this film. But it does not rise to that level of those other category of threats that seem to me to be more clearly understood in cyberspace as acts of cyber war and of aggression. What also I think muddied this a little bit is the President came out and used a very interesting word in describing what the Sony hack was. He didn't call it an attack. He actually did not call it an act of war. He called it an act of vandalism. And I am not aware of another instance when the President of the United States has deployed state power and resources in response to an act of vandalism. So this is a whole new set of ideas that we're grappling with in response to the Sony attack, and I don't think it's made any clearer what's going to happen when there is another attack on a company like Sony that results in a loss of data or damage to their systems. In fact, we actually have had one, the Sands Casino attack, which the administration and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence have attributed to the government of Iran. I'm not aware of any response that we took to the government of Iran for that action, nor to their aggressive actions on U.S. banks in 2012. So, I think it's a really important question, and I don't know that there really are any easy answers, but one answer to it might be that what rises to a level of national security concern in cyberspace is what the President of the United States says rises to a level of national concern in cyberspace. We'll maybe talk more on the panel and others have in the past about why Sony triggered that event, and I think there are still more responses that were taken to that event that we don't fully know about. But I think that that's a very important moment to watch because from my reporting, what I found is that for the administration, attributing that attack to North Korea was not the hard part. Now, there was initial, bout of real skepticism in the technology community about the administration's claims that that North Korea was behind it. Ultimately, the administration had to reveal more intelligence that they had about why they thought it was definitive that North Korea was responsible. The President of the United States presumably would not be allowed to go on national television and blame North Korea unless his intelligence community was very, very sure that they were right. And then, of course, here at Fordham, not long after he gave that speech, FBI Director Jim Comey came out and blamed the North Koreans. So if we take it as a given that the administration is certain that North Korea was responsible for this, it seems to me that the attribution to North Korea was the easy part for them, or the easier part, and that the hard part was formulating the policy response. What are you going to do about this? And it seems to me like we are watching an administration sort of make policy, I won't say on the fly because there's real thoughtfulness behind it, but you're watching that emerge, I think, in the Sony attack. It is the first time that we can really point to a clean example of the United States taking a direct proportional response, or at least what we claim is proportional, in response to an act of cyber aggression. That certainly puts it into the category of things that we should be thinking about when we're looking at what is the answer to this question of when does cyber aggression rise to the level of a national security concern or even an act of war.
Very good, thank you. So one thing that I think we've seen this morning is that the idea of when does a cyber threat rise to the level of a national security concern, it's really national. It's really international. It's the perspective of each individual country and how they interpret that. I'd like to start off with a question regarding our allies. Cyber incidents are happening to our allies. When does such an incident become a national security issue to the United States? So I'll throw that out to the panel and see.
So this was a constant debate in the first Obama administration. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security narrated or wrote, I was in charge of this exercise, the first ever quadrennial Homeland Security review. And we said the value proposition of the Department of Homeland Security is to help create a safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. And in order to do that, we need to do 5 things. We need to prevent another 9/11. We need to secure and administer our borders. We need to administer and enforce our immigration laws. We need to build resilience in the face of disasters. And we need to ensure the cybersecurity of the nation's critical infrastructure. Now, as we looked at this, the question is, everybody wanted to move to the black and white trigger point at which something became a national security problem. But at the time, and still, we approach it sort of with binocular vision. We look at these things as national security problems. And that really restricts the latitude and the degrees of freedom we have as a federal government to respond. In national security, Washington is the national command authority. In homeland security, Washington is the federal partner. There are many more degrees of freedom in approaching this. And there's no question that cyberspace is contested space, but it is fundamentally civilian space. We're not going to be able to manage it like a war zone.
I'll just take a stab at the question, too. I mean, if we're talking about, are we talking about attacks on allies here, and how do we...
Yes, or incidents.
Sure. Yes. I mean, well, recently the NATO charter has been, I don't know if amended is the right word, but I mean, now a cyber attack, and again, what do you qualify as a cyber attack, is a triggering event that can trigger the mutual self-defense aspects of NATO. So we are at least now asserting as an alliance that a cyber attack on a member of that alliance is considered an attack on the entire alliance. Now, I didn't hear anyone rushing, to trigger that when Sony got hacked. But, we're certainly conceiving of how do we take these traditional existing military and strategic alliances and sort of layer cyber over them. And I think that's instructive. I mean, I think for the military, they're trying to see this certainly as cyberspace as a 5th domain of warfare, right? After air, land, sea, and outer space. And if you can start to sort of look at it through that lens, I'm not saying it necessarily becomes clearer, but it certainly seems like the applications they're making they're trying to be more direct about it. Why can't we just have cyber rules and cyber responses the same way we do for kinetic rules and responses and apply that to the alliance? It's certainly an interesting idea. It hasn't been tested yet.
Greg, I just say that from a financial economic standpoint, it's hard to draw the border lines, right? So if you're attacking, Deutsche Bank, you're attacking the global financial system. And from our point of view, we're protecting the financial system from illicit actors. And, financial system doesn't stop at the border. So just from my little aspect, I would say there is no difference.
Okay, very good. Now, I think that raises, I'll just do a follow-on question for Kip. The idea of our the interdependencies in the financial system. I've heard frequently, and I tend to believe, that there are actors out there who can do devastating damage to our financial sector. They've just chosen not to. And in your initial remarks, you've said that governments have historically shied away from such activity. Do you believe that would be the case, or do you see that we could see significant actions against, say, our financial sector by a nation state?
Well, I'm no technical expert. I mean, if you look at 9/11, we can say that terrorists haven't attacked, but 9/11 was the Trade Center was chosen, as a symbol, but also the heart of our financial sector. So I think that bad guys have shown a proclivity to go after us. As far as going after the financial sector, I mean, everybody's vulnerable. Everybody's on in the internet, and I don't think that they're any more vulnerable than anyone else, and they certainly spend a whole lot of money to try and back up and all that. But from a government standpoint, it'd be very deleterious.
All right, good. So moving on to another subject, but still related. Now, several of the threat actors, countries that have been accused of significant malicious internet activity have really been acting through proxies. At least that's the conventional wisdom, things like criminal organizations or allied hacker organizations. Is this proving to be a viable defensive strategy to act through proxies, such as criminal organizations that you have a tight relationship with? And the follow-on question to that is there a proxy strategy that is legal and viable for the United States, perhaps?
Well, I think it was an effective strategy up until the point maybe where the administration decided to start naming and shaming the Russian government as being behind more of the aggressive cyber attacks on U.S. facilities in the past couple of years. I mean, it's fairly well known that cyber criminals operating in Russia have a nexus. I mean, Kip can talk much more directly about this than I can probably, or maybe he doesn't want to the Russian government and sort of act as proxies in that way. But I think that the administration's policy has been to hold governments accountable directly and to sort of try to rip back the mask of that. It's not at all clear to me that North Korea did not operate with proxies. I mean, I don't know whether or not someone sat there in Pyongyang and hacked into Sony, or whether they hired people to do it. But in any event, clearly the administration's policy is that doesn't matter. It's like we are tracing this back to you as a government and holding you responsible for what you do directly or what you do by hiring freelancers.
I don't know. It seems to me as though most governments want to have that plausible deniability, but in a lot of cases, the hack is intended as a diplomatic démarche, right? I mean, the Iranians went after us. They can deny that they did it, but they wanted us to know that they could do it and that they were responsible. And so, a lot of times this, mystery as to who's behind it. I mean, clearly the type of attack and the political context tells you exactly who's behind it. But just as nobody admits to doing these things.
It's a really good illustration, though, and I think Shane is pointing to this of the where you stand depends on where you sit. There was a time, and it's even still mostly true. If you talk to national security types, where is the greatest threat in cyberspace? And they will tell you China or Iran. If you talk to law enforcement types, they'll tell you the greatest threat is, as Kip alluded to, is gangs, organized criminal behavior, a lot of it originating, I should say, from the Caucasus and elsewhere. Those are the party lines with respect to the threats that we face in cyber. Are there relationships between the private sector and governments worldwide? Of course there are. But nobody has got a really clear theory of the case when it comes either to how we will best defend ourselves against the threats that we do see in cyberspace, or what the role of governments will be, or even how to treat information with respect to threats. Information is really contested space in cyber. From a security and intelligence point of view, you want to keep information secret so you can learn more about your adversary. From a law enforcement and from an operator's point of view, you want to use information to prevent bad things from happening. And from a law enforcement point of view, you want to preserve information for successful prosecution. Information is therefore highly contested space when it comes to cyber threats and cyber action.
Would anyone care to comment on whether U.S. law might allow for a proxy strategy? Is it viable for the U.S. rather than acting directly to work through a proxy in some fashion?
Well, do we define proxy as we are hiring someone else to do it, or do we define that as we're masking, where the attack came from and
Yeah, I'm not thinking
kind of
at a technical
things.
level. It's not going through a chain of proxies in terms of servers, but I'm thinking more organizational.
Well, there's been an interesting, theory that's been put forward by some sort of thinkers on the policy level of this. Could the United States combat cyber espionage, cybercrime, maybe even nation-state actors by adopting a model of counter-piracy, where you use something like letters of marque, where you actually enable private actors acting under the authority of the U.S. government to go out and hack back and take down the bad guys, sort of private security forces. I think it's a really fascinating idea. I mean, I don't hear it being debated anywhere, and there are lots of reasons, lots of pitfalls to it. But that is, I think, one approach that certainly in the academic space or the theoretical kind of thinking world in cyber policy has been floated as could the United States actually hire people to go out and sort of handle these operations for them? I suppose that would be one form of proxy acting.
Good.
I mean, if we're only talking about the role of third parties or proxies, so-called proxies, and sort of fighting and winning the nation's wars, I mean, anybody's opinion I think is as good as the next person's. I mean, to me, the U.S. government, frankly, at every level, is used to working with private sector partners, with other partners, international partners, businesses, communities, et cetera. The real challenge that we have is to answer the question, to what end, to what purpose? I mean, I come back to what I said, we're not going to be able to run the cybersecurity of this country against a considerable array of threats, like a military campaign, like an intelligence program, or like sort of an extended game of I've got a secret. I mean, it has got to be something that enfranchises all of us in a way that has practical effect of making us safer.
Okay, good, thank you. So I'd like to ask a question of the audience for a show of hands. We've thrown the phrase hacking back, and also earlier today we heard the kind of the Wild West scenario, how companies are defending themselves against nation states. So, and I'm not asking to attribute anything to your personal organization, but who of you have heard of companies, United States companies actually hacking back or employing those to do so, paying people to do that? One hand? Two? Three? A lot of hands raised just at ear level, but
who's going to admit it?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I'm not saying that you're admitting it. I'm saying that you may have heard in the local pub or something like that people discussing it. But I think it's a useful question, and I haven't heard it come up when you talk to people quietly that this type of activity goes on. But I was just interested to hear what the audience might have to say. So we've heard about nation-state actors, but what about hacktivism, hacktivist groups? Does hacktivism ever perform a beneficial function? As an example, might anonymous targeting of extremist websites be considered a beneficial function? So the question is, does hacktivism ever perform a beneficial function?
I suppose you could argue, I mean, I'm not sure I would argue this, but one could argue it, that sure, like there's actually a branch. I don't know if you can say anonymous has branches, but there's a group of people online who identify themselves with anonymous that go by the moniker Operation Death Eaters, and their whole business is trying to expose child pornography and human sex trafficking. Now, are they doing this by mostly going through open source information, bringing, cases to people's attentions, tweeting at journalists, things like this? Yes, I mean, I've definitely seen that. Now, whether you cross the line into actively hacking into, let's say, a database and stealing information that exposes the people that you're after, I mean, obviously now you're moving into what the United States would say is a criminal realm. But there's, sure, I think we can theoretically conceive of how hacktivism has some sort of social and public good. There's civil disobedience on the internet. There's a long tradition of that in the United States as well. I'm not sure that most of the hacktivist examples that have gotten the most attention would fall into that category of being helpful. Many of them seem to be pretty malicious, but I think that we can't lump all hacktivism into, with one broad brush and say it's all, negative hacking.
So from the research that you've conducted, did you ever get a sense that the government's maybe turning a blind eye to behavior, because it's largely illegal, right? What we're talking about is the behavior's illegal. But do you think that governments turn a blind eye to certain types of activist behavior that they support, and then they go after what they disagree with, even though they're equally illegal, perhaps? Yeah,
so I mean, you can go, I actually wrote a piece about this about 2 weeks ago. After the Sony hack, you can go on sort of some of the online forums and even go on to places like Reddit, frankly, and you can watch people having conversations about scanning the internet in North Korea, looking for vulnerable systems, watching some go down. We remember the North Korean internet suddenly went down not long after Obama came out and talked about North Korea being responsible for the Sony hack. There are many people who believe, and some hacktivists have claimed responsibility for that. The United States government hasn't done anything in response to that. You can actually go through and read the conversation threads where people are openly talking about, hey, essentially, should we hack this piece of the network and see what damage we can do? And a couple of them, there's actually one exchange where somebody says, well, that would be illegal, and the other guy says, yeah, well, no one's really going to do anything about it. It's North Korea. So if I'm aware of that, I presume the National Security Agency is aware that activity was happening, and I haven't heard about anybody being indicted for it.
Okay, good. Yeah, perfect. See, there are advantages to not having ever had a security clearance because you can...
I can actually read those things, yeah.
You can say anything you want. You can read the Snowden documents, all that stuff. They'll send us to jail, presumably, if we do. All right, so one final question before we get into your questions, and I think it's useful to get the panel's opinion to frame the idea of where the line is. So, what for the panelists, what do you see as the boundary between an incident being a law enforcement issue and one requiring a national level DIME response, like diplomatic, informational, military, economic response? So the boundary between law enforcement and government, national level government response.
So this was and remains a big debate in policy circles. I mean, some say, we've got the extremes and everything in between. There are those who say, frankly, government should just stay out of this. The internet evolved organically, instantaneously to the benefit of mankind, largely without government interference. Let the market take care of this. Isn't that a good idea? And then there are others who say, are you kidding me? It's so dangerous, it's so vital to our way of life that we need to hand this over to the US military to keep us safe in the face. So that really spans the debate. We can all find ourselves somewhere in the middle, I think, on this. And so, the question, I think, is not, is it law enforcement or is it do we need a military response? The question, I think begins with, do we have confidence in what's happening? Where are we going to reside, or where are we going to assign the responsibility for what level of protection? We don't have the military walking the streets in the United States everywhere. How do we construct our lives? Because there is no enterprise delivering value in the United States economy, or frankly in the global economy, that doesn't rely on IT and access to the internet. There is simply none. So our reliance is complete, as Shane and Kip both, I think, mentioned. When in framing the debate, one of the standards that was discussed is, well, when other defenses have failed. Well, what does that mean? That means the enterprise defenses and the sectoral defenses and the broader company defenses, and that we've consulted broadly with our allies. Sometimes it's just a phone call to a server farm that will stop a problem. So this is very much at the heart of a question. People are searching for bright lines, and as Kip said, there are none.
So just one related follow-up question for the panel. Really, I get a sense for there being perverse incentives with our market, let the market decide kind of models. The products are rushed to market, perhaps, and are quite profitable, but often security is bolted on after the fact, if at all. It kind of brings to mind the idea of recalling automobiles. That really an organization doesn't perform a recall typically unless they feel like the liability far exceeds the potential liability exceeds the cost of the recall itself. So, could you comment each on perverse incentives that you might see that we're faced with that are that are frustrating the idea of security?
I'll just mention one. I'll pick on people who are sort of in what's now being known as the threat intelligence and analysis space. So, experts and self-professed technical experts, of which I am not one, by the way, but issuing reports saying nation-state actor X was behind all these terrible things, and here's the data that shows you why. And when you peel back the data, you find the data is actually not very sophisticated, and a lot of the analytic leaps are pretty big. There is definitely an incentive and an interest for companies that are selling the services of doing cyber defense and will come in and protect your network and keep the bad guys out, to put out reports saying the bad guys are everywhere. Which is not to say that there aren't bad guys out there, but I think that there is an incentive for some analysts to come out and try to make a name for themselves and their companies by making large claims about countries in rough parts of the world, and you can figure out which one I'm talking about if you're paying attention to the news in the past week. But so there is an incentive, I think, for a lot of people to come forward and to position themselves as authorities on a subject and to make analytic leaps that can get people very scared and ahead of themselves and make them want to come hire those companies to protect them.
I think this is relevant. I lived most of my life in the intelligence world and have moved over where we're probably focused more on law enforcement, although I'm still the intelligence voice in the room. And if you look at 9/11, post 9/11, it could be argued that it was an intelligence failure, an intelligence letdown. But from a law enforcement side, we identified all the perpetrators. Bin Laden's been brought to justice. It becomes a law enforcement success, but that really doesn't mean anything, does it? So that's great, fantastic. I'm an intel guy at my heart. I want to prevent things. So in a lot of cases, what we're looking at here is, I think, the law enforcement focus of building cases and putting people in jail, can have a deterrent effect. But really what we're looking for here is, once the attack's taken place, it's kind of too late. Once the system's been brought down or the financial damage has been done to the U.S. system, so I think that one of those conundrums has to do with that pull between, the intelligence aspect of it and the law enforcement aspect. Whether we're going to change a policy, before the fact, or wait until the disaster happens and then go the other way.
Frankly, I think our system is wildly out of whack. It's wildly out of whack. Private sector institutions can't share information with each other or with the government, can't share information with the government because then there are accusations of agency. They can't share information with each other. This is on cyber threats now. We haven't sorted through this. We need legislation, not only to incentivize, but to indemnify against ordinary, crime on the street equivalent information sharing. That's a problem. Everyone's sort of talking now, the big buzz is cyber insurance, but we can't write cyber insurance policies because we need more data. When was the first automobile policy written? In the 1890s. Not a whole lot of data out there about driving habits, right? So we talk about, well, let's treat it like safety. Okay, when were seatbelts introduced into American automobiles? In the 30s. When was the first law passed mandating them? Here in New York in the 80s. It took us 50 years. We are too vulnerable right now. And there are all kinds of disincentives. It's outrageous that we get computer equipment shipped to us without the security settings activated and ready to go. It's as if we knew that seatbelts save lives, but you've got to run down to the hardware store. First of all, go online, go to the J.C. Whitney catalog, figure out which one belongs to you, run downstairs down the street to the hardware store, buy the webbing and the bolts, and install it yourself. That's crazy. We have got to step back and take a sensibilized approach to sharing the responsibility for better security in cyberspace and not treat it all like it's a problem for some office in the government to handle.
Wow, great. That's probably the best analogy I've heard.
And she used the J.C. Whitney catalog, which is incredible that she knows about the J.C. Whitney catalog. I only know because my brother restored automobiles and used to get it. Incredible.
But I think that brings up the point that there are things we can do that can solve 80% of the problem. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Just like you said, security settings, the things that can be done in the workplace to help sure that we're doing all the basics right, the hygiene piece, and I would argue it's not being done, or it's not being done well in many places. Okay, with that, now's your turn. We have about 30 minutes left and would like to hear your questions. Please wait for the microphone and we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks. So we'll have someone get the microphone to you.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that the first automobile insurance was issued in 1890. You also had turnpikes, which were private roads. Is there any discussion about private solutions where there are private networks and private data? Thus, the risk is arbitrage to private actors and governments are not involved.
You want to take a few
Take a few
questions? I mean, it's up to you.
well, I think we'll take one at a time. Okay, so I'll throw that out to panelists. Anyone care to comment? If not, I can. I can. Okay.
Well, I guess I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you're getting at. I mean, it seems to me right now, most of the risk is actually on private actors, and the liability is on them. But
so if we're looking at the fact that the risk is on private actors right now, are we not dealing with something that is temporal in nature, where the market will then go ahead and adjust and create the security apparatus that is necessary through free market operations? Why is there a necessity for the government to get involved in these issues when, with a little bit of time, free market solutions will develop spontaneously?
I guess I would argue that the government is involved. We don't allow, in the financial sector, banks are not allowed to talk to each other for very good reasons. They can't collude. But sharing IP addresses seems to me a fairly, innocuous thing. But they don't feel comfortable doing it. So the free market is not going to adjust in this case because there has to be a safe harbor for them to communicate.
I think, though, that there is some reason to think that the market is adjusting. I mean, when I was at RSA, which is the big cybersecurity conference this past week, the big theme was the extent to which hardcore cybersecurity, folks who work in their organizations finally think that the CEO is paying attention to them because of Target and Home Depot. And, that they realize that they not only have a fiduciary responsibility to do good cybersecurity in their companies, but there's a very good chance that they'll end up on the front page of the New York Times if they don't. And if you were like, the president of Sony Pictures, you'll be out of a job. So there is something of a correcting kind of mechanism happening that's forcing some of these companies to certainly spend more and take it more seriously. Now, does that mean that it's going to result in dramatically better security? I'm not sure, because obviously the advantage is always to the offense. But it seems to me that there's something moving in that direction a little bit lately, if for no other reason than nobody wants to be the next CEO sitting in the hot seat.
So I agree that something is going on. I'm not sure it's the market correcting our problem. The market is largely inert on this question. It is true that firms are waking up and C-suites are waking up and boards of directors are waking up to the fact that cybersecurity could cost them their job, but they're not approaching it in anything like kind of a systematic way. And they're not, the market's a wonderful mechanism, except when it's not. And it's really not. We don't give the market sole responsibility for solving any of our problems. And we certainly don't give, we haven't wanted to send a market message on security. And so I'm not sure why we would think it would be a good idea now.
One last point. The market is certainly telling us that things are going to get worse.
Yeah, that's
because some of the highest valued IPOs in the past year have been private cybersecurity companies. Well, hugely valued and probably way overvalued too.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm sure the audience would appreciate stock tips as well. Specific. Doesn't it really come down to their limits of what companies are able to do, what the market can do, and that there's the role of government, and the government takes over certain functions that the market is just fundamentally unable to deal with, right? They can't. Google does not have an army, right? And can't make laws, and that there are things that ultimately it's a partnership, right? Okay, next question. First hand was there.
Hi, thank you. I'm a little puzzled about the government role here. I hear you that the market may not be capable, but we also heard from Kip that the government is perhaps not even capable of hiring talented enough technical people. And certainly we know that the government had a hard time building a website not too long ago. On the other hand, we heard Richard Clark tell us the NSA is the only entity on the planet that can actually do anything about this problem. So I hear you on the market failure, but maybe Kip or others can talk about the government. Is the government actually capable of moving in this area effectively?
Well, I don't know that I want to be quoted on that. I think I think that my point is that the government's not agile. I mean, I don't think that's any great lesson. We're not agile. We don't move quickly. And in this space, you have to move rather quickly. So, I mean, I think my advocacy would be for public-private partnership. When you look at information sharing, where the government can facilitate information sharing, there's good reasons why we don't want banks and companies sitting around sharing information, because that's how we got where we did with, in the our great past with monopolies and oligopolies and all that. But at the end of the day, on some of these public security issues, it's real important. My hiring issue, I'm sure that we'll ultimately hire those people, but I need them tomorrow, and a private sector firm can hire them tomorrow. I mean, I think that's why we see the multiplicity of, private sector reactions. And, I had a boss one time who said that, the problem is that we need government needs a tugboat, and we build an aircraft carrier. And so aircraft carriers turn very slow, and they're very powerful. And I think the government is very powerful and can be very powerful in this space, just not quickly.
I love Dick Clark. I think he's flat wrong. NSA can't do all that needs doing. Government can't do all that needs doing. I mean, who should be in charge here? Who's in charge of driving? Who's in charge of driving? Most of us get in a car to get where we're going, and most of us do it most of the time, mostly safely and successfully. Who's in charge? Well, we've got a distribution of responsibility as a driver, as a passenger, as a pedestrian. And we know it's basically working because when stuff goes wrong, we know how to assign responsibility, and we break it up. Everybody knows that's a bad curve when it rains. Well, if everybody knows that, why don't we do something about it? So we distribute responsibility. I mean, I want to come back to something that Kip said and you mentioned about cyber talent. The high-end cyber talent is as scarce as hen's teeth. I mean, you got to be able to identify, recruit, and retain these folks, and they are bright, young people in this greatest generation in their 20s and 30s. These kids are extraordinary. The standard way of approaching it, we cannot do business as usual. This is not a business as usual problem. We've got to broaden the pipeline between government, academia, and industry. I mean, let's just make government a must-stop hop in your career. You don't all have to be, career civil servants. I mean, just make it a must-stop hop. How do we improve our contracting? How do we improve our ability to swarm when there's a problem? And this is a real problem, the scarcity of talent, and it's not just government's problem.
I just say one quick point. I think Jane's onto something here. When you can hear Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, saying this out in Silicon Valley this week, with this idea of coming to people and saying, we're not asking you to stop doing what you're doing in the private sector and come work for the government, but what if you think of the idea of public service for 2 years or 3 years? I mean, if you can pitch it as public service, you're doing good, you'll get to do really cool things and see stuff you can't see in the private sector. That's one way I think government can is now going to try to tap into private sector expertise and say it's not an either-or proposition. You have to work on one side of the wall or the other, but come over here and do this for a while, then you can go back.
Okay. Very good. Sir, did you still have your question? Yeah, okay. White shirt, center, right there, yeah.
I was wondering what the 4 questions were that you could ask a company that would prevent 80% or possibly attacks on that company.
Yeah, prevent or limit the damage,
Yes.
right? I would say, number 1, do you know what's connected to your network? Number 1, do you know what's connected to your network? Question number 2, do you know what's running or trying to run on your network? Question number 3, do you know who has administrative permission to change, bypass, or override your security settings? And question number 4, do you have an automated system in place that alerts you to dangers and allows you to get inside the patch window to reduce your vulnerability? And there's a 5th question. When you're asking your technical staff this, ask them question number 5. How would you demonstrate this to me? those questions, basic cyber hygiene. You know, I mean, we own something called the 20 Critical Security Controls at the Center for Internet Security and the multi-state ISAC, the Information Security Analysis Center. That basic cyber hygiene will really reduce our vulnerability. And unpatched vulnerabilities is the greatest threat right now in cyberspace, bar none.
Ma'am, did you still have a question?
Hi, my name is Jen Xiao, a professor from a school of Galbraith Business School. I teach in financial statement analysis evaluation at Fordham. My question, my understanding is cybersecurity is really contingent risk. So I'm very interested when Kip mentioned that when Deutsche Bank is attacked, will be create a global financial system risk. So in your opinion, how can the key player at Wall Street team up together, probably put aside the money as an investment pool to minimize this attack? Should they team up together?
So how can Wall Street team up together to minimize risk?
Well, I mean, there are forums that they can team up, but I mean, my argument is that we have to push down that road further, where they can communicate more quickly. And I think there are some initiatives that were mentioned today. I think Dick Clark mentioned,
the ISAC. Yeah, I mean, the banks would tell you they already are, right? They would say collectively that they do a great job of security because they talk to each other about vulnerabilities in their network, and they know how they're built to the point of how they're, the architecture in them. One of the reasons that they historically resisted, offers of assistance, let's say, from the intelligence community to work on their networks was they said, well, we know how these networks are built and they're quite safe and they're resilient. Now, that's their position. And they will tell you that there are critical systems that aren't connected to the internet and there are redundancies and all these things in place. Generally speaking, I think most security experts think that the banks do the best job as a sector. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be a breach like a JP Morgan, which is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on security. But they are talking to each other, for sure.
But aren't there limits to those conversations? Because there are, my interactions have been, they like to play, they'll talk to the government a little, but they don't talk amongst themselves as much because they're competitors. Do you see those type of competitive
Well,
limits?
I think the talking only goes so far, right? But in terms of, I think from my understanding from talking to folks at the FSISAC, is that they're aware of where the critical sort of junctures are in the architecture of the financial system. At least they profess to know what they are. And essentially what they say is we don't need the government's help in telling us where they are. But there are certainly, I'm sure, in the cybersecurity legislation that's being pushed through right now could, dramatically increase the amount of information that they're able to share with the government and with each other in real time. And I think that's probably what Kip is going to, is how do you get to the real-time sharing, such that they would see an attack happening on the whole sector or something that could affect the whole sector in time to stop it. I think that's a different matter, I think.
Well, and also just to break in on the banks sharing information with each other, it can even be worse than that. Within a bank, sharing information from one jurisdiction to another can be a legal nightmare. If you've got, a major bank that operates in 96 countries, each one of those has a different legal framework. And so they may know that Jane is a money launderer, but because of personal information, they may not be able to share the information on her actions across money. She may be operating in 17 different jurisdictions in the same bank, and they may have trouble sharing that. There are ways around it, and they're working on that, but that adds to the complexity of what financial institutions are facing.
We talk about talking to each other all the time. There's a lot of B7 going on. Really, when it comes to cybersecurity and the financial sector ISAC and the multi-state ISAC we run, we also have aviation and healthcare. We all talk to the government. One thing Homeland Security doesn't get credited with nearly enough, and I'm obviously biased here, is the architecting over the past 5 or 6 years of a platform for sharing threat information and dialogue. There are still some people in the private sector who believe, if only we knew the secrets that the government knows, we could protect ourselves. Are you kidding me? They said, well, who else has threat information? I mean, for goodness sake, Dunkin' Donuts has threat information. Toys R Us has threat information. And if J.C. Whitney were around still, they would have threat information. I mean, the point is that this is, again, the difference between national security and homeland security. It's not need to know, it's duty to share. But I'm in a room full of lawyers, right? I'm a lawyer. What's the famous case from the Youngstown seizure case? I think it's Justice Jackson. Ours is a nation of laws, not of men. We submit to no rulers except under rules. Well, okay, let's put some rules in place so that we can get on with this duty to share threat information that really is exposing all of us.
Do you think it's based primarily on, or heavily on personal relationships too, or augmented by personal relationships amongst the security officials in the various organizations are actually quietly helping each other out in a way that is productive for all? Do you think that goes on?
To a large extent it is, but that's not really the talking that matters. What we're talking about is automated data exchange via sticks and taxi or some other means of rationalizing so machines can talk to machines and have the benefit of malware and other important kinds of cybersecurity information in something approaching real time.
Yeah, at speed. Okay. Now, sir, did you have a question earlier or no? Okay. So right here, and then we'll get to the edges next, I promise.
Any reaction to the assertion that the difference between U.S. government hacking and Chinese government hacking is that the U.S. government doesn't share the fruits with private industry? I mean, especially banks and private military contractors, for example? And does it matter?
Well, the U.S. government doesn't, and I can tell you that, just to talk to when I was when I was in the IC, to talk to the private sector, you go through all kinds of hoops. So there is no, the difference is we don't share and they do. I mean, you can go back and read about the French, bugging airliners, Air France over, for commercial information. Other governments do. The U.S. doesn't, and there's a lot of good reasons why we don't. I mean, one of the reasons is if we give it to one company, have we given it to all the other companies? And now a further issue is if you even decided to do it, what is a U.S. company? So, we have all kinds of reasons. I mean, even if we decided as a nation that it was wise to do it, I don't think we could carry it off with so, no, we don't. It does not happen. The only time I've ever seen it happen is if there's a threat, and you might go off and brief people on the threat, but that's usually a physical threat, not some kind of a financial threat. So there might be some defensive sharing. I'm not familiar with what is shared, but certainly not in the offensive way that the Chinese are guilty of and other governments are, no.
I could imagine the circus that would ensue if there was some sort of secret access and the defense contractors all climbing on top of each other trying to get access to it, yeah. Any other comments on the question? No. Okay, we'll go to the edges. All right, sir in the back with the red tie.
I think firstly, thank you. I think fascinating insights. I think in large part we've talked about some tactical and arguably maybe some strategic issues that are more in the defensive nature so far. And I think Jane touched on a number of issues that perhaps suggest maybe the potential for wider sea changes. And I guess I was going to ask each of you, is there anything over the top, over the horizon, that may look at changes in architecture, changes in perhaps shared responsibilities, more of to Jane's point, a more public sector, public safety perspective? One analogy that was presented to me I thought was fascinating was if we look at internet security or cybersecurity as an issue of fire and how large urban areas oftentimes early days had full scale fires across the cities, taking out large elements of them. And then over time we had better technologies, more fire resistant technologies. We had different codes that came into place where now that threat is really secondary. And that's perhaps channeling some of what Jane spoke about in terms of public safety. But if that's a strategic perspective, are there also technology changes perhaps on the horizon that you would see as perhaps, again, sea changes that would impact this area dramatically?
The way when I'm looking at this world, I see technology way out here. And again, there are so many innovative and disruptive things. There's technology now that puts transmissibility in ink and in paint. I mean, you can literally draw an antenna on a wall. And you know, innovations in connectivity or in conductivity are, you know, again, and popularizing these. It's real. So technology is way out here. It's kind of interesting, right? Because technology is precisely the word that was invented to when tools came into man's grasp. And now it's exactly the word we use to describe the incomprehensible. You know, it's technology. I mean, then we've got society and the social wave kind of trailing it, but we're all doing it pretty eagerly. I mean, the lagging indicator, or, you know, the law is always a lagging indicator, but what's really lagging is the law. You know, law helps you anticipate the familiar, and there feels like there ought to be a lot of analogies out there that are familiar and ought to guide us, but we're unsatisfied fundamentally. I mean, in this whole space, there's an awful lot of wand waving, you know? I mean, there's a lot of wizardry. Yeah, I mean, you ought to, when you talk to your technologist, you ought to begin every conversation with, put your wand away. You know, I mean, a lot of us, you know, we're not lawyers, but we can understand when our lawyers speak to us. We're not accountants, but we can understand when our financial folks speak to us. We can understand our technical folks, too, and they're dying to be understood. And we don't all have to run out and learn Dolphin. I mean, it's really possible. So, you know, the answer is, for me, at least, the game changer in this whole space is the broad-scale adoption of basic hygiene. I mean, we're all on the same internet. The threat that you're facing is not unique to you. I mean, I don't know about you. I don't send my daughter out in the morning to go to school. I don't brief her on streptococcal this and meningococcal that. I say, wash your hands, don't share your food, cough into your sleeve. You know, I don't read her the blotter report. I give her some basic hygiene, allows her to negotiate her day most of the time relatively safely. That will be a game changer in this space.
I'll just put in one thing in the more kind of near space. I don't know if it'll be game-changing, but I think it could be pivotal. And we haven't talked about it actually yet, is the executive order that President Obama signed allowing for the use of sanctions for not just cyber actors who steal information, but the recipients of that information, to the point of, you know, cyber espionage. That's a really significant tool, it seems to me, that actually has not gotten enough attention from people in my profession. I mean, maybe Kip wants to talk about it, but that's a big moment. And so I think you do see this administration taking some very tangible steps to try and flex the cyber muscle, as it were, but using tools that we already have at our authority to try and deter bad behavior.
Yeah, I would say that's a good tool. My thing would be, and the reason why I care so much about information sharing is the use of big data. I know in government, and I would say even in the major financial institutions, I don't think they've scratched the surface on how useful big data can be. And I think we're starting to get there, but if you're not able to share data, it becomes less useful. So, you know, I know it's always the panacea, and it's always around, you know, it's always what they used to say, you know, Brazil's future is ahead of it and always will be. You know, big data always seems to be that panacea that's going to help us tomorrow, but I think that it is.
Good. Sir.
Thanks for your talk. This may be off topic, but probably three of you have top secret clearances, and we probably have, tens of thousands of people in the government who have top secret or so clearances. And I'm wondering to what extent our security laws, criminal laws dealing with security releases affect the ability of government workers to have a dialogue that's open and robust about things like you're talking about, and whether our laws are a little bit too restrictive or maybe a lot too restrictive, and maybe we overclassify information. Because I think there's probably a lot of people who might like to get involved in the debate, but may be reluctant because they're worried about the security law, clearance laws.
Yeah, we can't talk about it. No, I don't, you know, having a clearance or doesn't have a clearance doesn't prevent you from having this kind of a conversation. When you sort of get to be our age, you suddenly at some point you realize that you've become the people you've talked about your whole career, you know. And so what are you going to do with that authority and the position that you're in? And what you hope, and the kind of conversation that you're having here is the kind of conversation that's going on in Washington, you know, between officials. First of all, no one's trying to get it wrong, but these are really hard questions that on which there are different views that spring from, legitimate roots. I don't believe we're going to protect this country and protect our equities in cyberspace by trying to run this like a war zone or a military campaign or an intelligence program. Secrecy does not scale. We have, and we have a pretty prudent public, and the public is an asset in this whole issue. And I'm confident. I mean, the market will play a role. The government needs to step in because, for goodness sake, the market's not moving nearly fast enough, and we don't want it to play the only role.
Do you think the intelligence community is culturally particularly hampered by that, though? Like, it's a very insular community. It's all compartmented. It's all heads down, grinding away on classified information. Everything they touch is classified, probably top secret in certain places. Is that a cultural norm that can be overcome to help foster these conversations? Or should other entities or other parts of the organization or the U.S. government be doing that?
I don't know. I was going to say that his concerns are overblown, but there is a cultural proclivity for intelligence people not to be able to talk to the private sector. I mean, there's rules and regulations. I mean, if you have to fill out a form every time you talk to somebody, that you probably don't want to do that very often. In my current organization, that's not a problem because we're actually just outside the IC, just outside looking in. So we have frequent connects with the private sector. It's very useful. But for a conversation like this at this level, I don't think there's much of a problem.
Shane, so you've done a lot of research. I mean, you probably have talked to a lot of people with clearances. And what were your interactions?
Discreet. No, I think that there has been a shroud of secrecy around all things cyber for a long time. And, the level of detail that we're having in public conversations like this and that have been on other panels in the past 2 years, that's new, in my opinion. I mean, 5, 6, 7 years ago, people were a lot more reluctant to talk about anything, certainly that the government was doing in the operational aspects of cyberspace, which is not to say that they're completely throwing open everything now and saying, come read all of the map store exploits or whatever. But, there are senior military officials who routinely go out and talk about the cyber forces that the DoD is standing up and how they're going to be arranged and how they're going to be organized. And those are conversations that wouldn't have happened some time ago. And I think two things have happened. One, cyber has become, let's face it, a huge driver of budgets. So there's an incentive for people to come out and talk about the threat and also what they're doing about the threat. But also, it's just kind of hard to ignore. I'll go back to the Sony example. When the president decides to come out and talk about Sony, it's not as if, nobody knew Sony had been hacked. We were seeing that it had been hacked, the damage that had been caused. People were speculating about who got in, how they did it. So at some point, there's sort of, it just becomes too big of a problem to say, well, we can't talk about that because it involves classified issues. You had the president declassifying information in the Sony case, and the FBI director going out and here and publicly talking about things that 3-4 years ago about attribution they never would have talked about. And I think part of that is just because the problem has become big and visible, and it's almost sort of foolish to hide behind this idea of like, well, we can't talk about it because it's secret. It's everywhere. Everyone can read about it in the paper now.
So Shane's really right about this. Up until recently, the government treated major cyber problems as a matter for the intelligence community and the national security community. And up until relatively recently, business has treated cyber intrusions as a nuisance or the cost of doing business. Neither position is tenable anymore.
Okay, great. So we're at time, and I'd like to just have a round of applause for our panelists.